encourage you to jump in wherever you feel. I don't think you're going to be chaotic at all. But we had the budget discussion, post-budget discussion last year. Some of you were there, and I'm hoping the rest looked on. How do you think matters have evolved since then? At that time, people had a short time to look at the budget. But you raised almost everything that was of importance. You spoke about education, you spoke about youth alienation, you tackled the issue of the poor quality of the consultation process. You talked about tokenism, infrastructural needs, the pension age and the impact on young people who have to wait maybe 5 more years and so on. You raised all the crime, of course, and various biases and so on. So in hindsight, looking in the rearview mirror, what would your thoughts be about how the actual implementation of the budget and its hoped for impact that you might have seen and assumed was there? How has it been realized? Who wants to jump in?
I think some of the things that we now have to consider, or just to add, how is it realized? There's a lot more information now that has been readily available. So if you go online, you find summaries. Yes, sometimes the media can be a little bit misconstrued in how information is portrayed, but there's now budget discussions like these. There are things on television. There are reports that are coming out. Young people are now more at the center of accessing information, but we still have little challenges where we need to look at how people could take an interest. We were speaking on this previously earlier, that more persons need to be more to take this seriously. The budget is not something that nobody should take lightly because it affects everyday Trinidad and Tobagonians. So we need to be more readily available to contribute. Don't let people be afraid of sharing their voices, their opinions, and to make this more comfortable.
I mean, looking back at what we discussed, because I think most of us were present in that room, if not all of us, we still have a lot of issues that exist for us till date. I mean, underemployment and unemployment is still a major issue amongst all of us young people. I mean, some of us in the room here could testify to that as well. When we look at the infrastructure, I mean, how much time did you all spend in traffic this morning getting here? And are we doing enough to try to eliminate that challenge? Well, I have to say I'm very thankful. I know the topic of renewable energy came up, and we have quite a few solar parks, and I know the relevant ministries are working on that, but there is so much more that we could do, you know, and I'm looking forward to seeing much more, and I'm hoping that this budget will bear some more fruit to that. And I just want to say, you know, I have a special place in my heart for my DNS, because I'm very thankful for the programs that they have rolled out for our young persons, particularly those programs that focus on agriculture. So I'm hoping in this upcoming term that we can see a little bit when it comes to the mix with agriculture and technology and how AI can play a part in that as well.
I think looking back for me, I have to start answering that question with a question. What has changed since then? Such a significant amount of money that is budgeted is spent on recurrent expenditure that we're left with little money to actually invest in innovation. And so last year when we were having conversations, so many of the recommendations that young people would have made would have been things that fall within the realm of innovation, or changing the way in which we use public funds and funding different types of initiatives to deal with things like unemployment, underemployment, to deal with infrastructural development. There were conversations about investing in mental health support services. And you know, those things haven't really been realized. So it's difficult to say that when you look backward that there's going to be much change, because the process itself has remained the same. So that leads me to, you know, now wondering, okay, perhaps we need to revisit that process to really realize and see true change. There, of course, has been developments, as Samantha did rightfully mention. My DNS has done a very good job when it comes to rolling out things that specifically target young people. So it also does, you know, you have to look at things as well from a ministry perspective. Whose responsibility is this? And whether or not the money that that specific ministry or that sector is allocated is enough money for them to actually be able to take initiatives and engage in some sort of innovation. And then I think it also does ultimately come down to, when we're looking backward, should we be looking backward to look forward? And that, I'll end with that statement.
So, reflecting on our post-budget discussion last year, I would have realized that there has been an increased interest in the area of agriculture, especially amongst our young people, you know, coming out of that sort of colonial thinking and basically bad mind towards agriculture. However, one thing that I would have mentioned in my contribution is the discussion as it relates to community centers and youths being more involved in their community. And last year, $19.5 million was actually allocated to community centers for community arts and crafts to be developed throughout community centers in Trinidad and Tobago. And the question that I have coming into this round is, where have that money been allocated? Because when you go to these community centers, you still have to pay to actually use the community centers for the young people to actually carry out an initiative. So my big question is, well, in this budget would be, where has the money gone? Has it been used, or are we going to reuse those funds that were allocated if they were not used?
I think reflecting as youth of Trinidad and Tobago, we don't appreciate the strides Trinidad and Tobago has been making, especially in terms of its youth. When you travel regionally and you listen to your friends talk about the situation of their youth parliament, it's extremely dormant. And they oftentimes ask us, wow, like how are you all doing that? Like, we wish we could have this here at our own island. But I think the main issue that we have been advocating for years is, when can we have that conversation with the minister responsible for finance? When can we as young people sit down and say, hey, we actually contributed to the budget? When the budget is presented in the Honorable House, we can say, listen, that preamble that you just presented, we were actually the technocrats for that. When can we have that bridge between us and the decision makers? And I think if we can achieve that, it's going to set a really excellent precedent. I think Trinidad and Tobago has already been doing a great job in terms of its youth. We touched on the Ministry for Youth Development, especially where climate change is concerned. If you look at the other islands, I don't think most of them could boast about having a national youth convention dedicated to combating climate change. So we really have to give kudos to our Ministry for Youth Development. I do look forward to what plans they have for fiscal 2025, and I will end with that.
Mm-hmm. So you've raised the issue of accountability, and you've raised the issue of consultation and having your input. But I want to ask the question of, is it up to the Minister of Finance to come and talk to you, or is it up to you to demand an audience? In other words, do you feel disempowered as young people to organize yourself and make that request? I can't see why he would say no. I mean, if he said no, that would be news, right? So what is stopping you from saying, because you all belong to various groups and you have the experience of organizing, that we are going to organize a youth convention on the budget before July. Before July, that's when all the various ministries submit their needs and demands and so on, and have your voice heard. What is it?
So first I want to actually congratulate the Ministry of Youth Development and National Service. Just rolled out their very first youth convention. It was about 2 weeks ago. And this year their team focused on climate change and sustainability. But you're right, we can consider or approach them to have one on the budget. But the Ministry of Youth Development and National Services, this is a new ministry, probably about 5 or 6 years ago. It was usually sports and youth, and they've really showed you the government's commitment to wanting to support young people is seen more now than ever, because not only is it that, the Ministry of Education is also one of the second highest ministries that gets a big allocation. Usually health and national security, and then Ministry of Education is somewhere right there. And that shows the commitment of this government to support initiatives for young people. You also see MYDNS, I will refer to it from now, is making more open spaces, because they do, apart from what Samantha would have shared earlier, they also do courtesy calls. So if you want, you can reach out to the minister's secretariat for that ministry. You can request a meeting. So they do make that bridge. But to get to finance, I assume that there's a little bit more protocol, but I'm assuming after today they can help bridge that gap through the relevant
yeah, but I'm
ministry.
asking about the sense of power that young people feel
Yes.
on their own, right? One of the issues that was raised by the group in looking at this year's budget was not just the allocation, but the productivity of the allocation.
Okay.
So I think somebody also raised the issue of community centers. I think it was you.
Yeah.
Community centers as buildings in which investment is made, and community centers as resources that bring young people in and facilitate the work that they want to do inside this building. So those are the kinds of points where you go beyond the allocation to look at how did this allocation facilitate the promised outcome. Now that is where I want you all to take this conversation, because there may be areas that you saw, yes, it delivered. Recurrent expenditure, we can take that virtually out of, well, I don't want to take it out of the equation, because the fundamental question you raised is the need to look again almost at a budget as a blank sheet of paper. You raised the question of review and forward. Are we at a point where we need to reconceptualize the budget? The budget is, after all, just a balance sheet. This is income, this is expenditure, and sometimes a Minister of Finance says, this is all that it is. Don't incorporate all the needs and wants and so on. This is what it is. But we know a budget is where you spend your money, that shows your priority. Where you do not spend. So from that perspective, I'd like you to consider, where did you see the allocations actually, those that promised some change? It might be roads, it might be traffic jams, right? It might be bringing more youth into agriculture, as many of you are identifying. And then we have to look at that actual issue of monitoring and evaluation of programs. Where do you see it has taken the script forward in some way that you can say this is a policy that is working and the money has been put and it's working?
I think that it's very difficult for us as young people specifically to engage in that system of monitoring and evaluation. We have, because it all ties back to this process of budgeting we have. And yes, the Parliament itself does have specific accountability mechanisms that young people do have the opportunity to tune into, like the PAC, the PAAC, the PAEC. And we see parliamentarians performing their function of being the monitor and the evaluator of, okay, how are public funds being used, what is it being used on, and ensuring that system of accountability. But as young people, we're still very much excluded from the process of budgeting, so it's very difficult to, one, understand the process, and then to contribute. You asked earlier in terms of engaging with the Minister of Finance, for example. When we look at, I think a lot of people have this misconception that the budget is the day the minister comes to speak. And from that, the Standing Finance Committee and this bill being carried through until it is assented to by the President. We have to understand that the budget is in and of itself a process born out of government policy and enacted, and it's operationalized through legislative intervention. And that process starts as early as May. So when we are having this conversation now, today, the budget for the next fiscal has already been set. So conversations today may not necessarily reflect what is going to be presented on Monday. I would hope that some of the interventions that were made last year by young people in this space would have been taken under advisement and incorporated. But the reality is that the way we budget is still very much technocrats make decisions, technocrats look at pieces of paper, it's very much quantitative data driving what is being done, and we don't have a qualitative approach and an equitable approach. If this is taxpayers' money that we're using, I would argue that, perhaps we need to revise that process of budgeting. It should not be in the hands of only technocrats. Technocrats have to work with and liaise with the average everyday man, woman, and child who feel the impact of the budget the most. And so we need to take an equitable approach to budgeting. That means going into communities, having consultations, because, okay, for example, we have, let's say we have a national convention, similar, and we want to talk about budgeting. Who are the young people that are going to be in that room? It's the young people who are privileged, who've had opportunities to make use of these spaces, but the average young person from a rural community or a grassroots community, their concern is more about getting a job, having food on the table, taking care of their family. And so they don't see themselves or feel empowered to make use of these spaces because there's no alignment, so to speak. So I think it would be more meaningful if that process is revised, go into communities, empower young people to see the budget as something that they should have a voice in, because at the end of the day, it is public funds. And then in doing that, we are also able to budget from an informed perspective, understanding that, okay, these specific communities have these specific needs. How do we then allocate funds for that? So I do think the process does need some significant revision, because right now, we could talk about what our hopes or dreams or ideals are, but where does that talk translate into the actual budgeting process?
But when you talk about consultation in that way, are we skipping the point that all of you have members of parliament that represent you? In other words, yes, you can represent yourself, yes, you can lobby, but how is that process working to feed into the system, the political system? And this has nothing to do with who is in office, who is not in office. We're talking about how the Constitution works, right?
Right.
So that what you think works its way up. How is that working? You want?
If I can, so before I touch on that, I'd like to touch on one area that I see the government, continuously trying to improve and modernize will be education, because I myself is someone who has the opportunity to benefit from programs such as GATE. As it relates to youth consultations and so forth, I'll give the example of the area that I'm from. So Mausika Maloney, Bonnie Aruka, Cane Farm, La Florissant, Lopino, and Mokoya, Trin-City, right? These are 4 electoral districts and they're under one umbrella. So I think a good move towards consulting with the youths is for these community leaders, local government councillors to actually come together, go out into the community and consult with the youths, because having a huge national consultation, we can see where that could get chaotic. So again, starting from the community level, as it relates to local government in particular, would be one of the best strategies moving forward.
I seem to recall that in the first session, the person from Tobago talked about going into the communities in order to get the information to inform the island agenda, right? And that is what we had hoped for, what we hope for with local government reform. But it takes citizens to push for that, right? Because if you're always waiting on government, you are actually supporting a top-down system. And what you want is citizen engagement using the parliamentary system to do that. So all of you, almost all of you, are in some area of engagement. And you, for example, are the director of participation, right, with UNFPA. How successful are you in getting young people to participate so that when we come to the budgeting process, their voices are heard? How is that working?
Very often we have post post-budget discussions, but very rare we would have a pre-budget discussion. If I have to be completely honest with you, I don't think I've ever been part of a pre-budget discussion. So that alone highlights the issue amongst us as young people. Because you rightfully said that we also need to take up that mantle and we have to make our voices be heard. I just want to mention, and this might ruffle a few feathers, but when it comes to election time, we always see our councillors, we see our MPs in our area. So why can't we apply that same approach to the matters of public affairs? The budgeting process does not just affect those at the top. It's the everyday citizens at the bottom. It's the young child who doesn't know how they're going to get to school, the single mother who doesn't know how she's going to ration, whether she's going to choose to buy food or the new shoes that she needs for work. And so we need to do better in terms of reaching the people on the ground to hear what their real issues are and how the things that we're doing at the top are also impacting them at the bottom. Mobilizing young people, we have to recognize and appreciate that young people make up a major part of Trinidad and Tobago. We are part of the biggest population. And taking voter rights and all of that out of it, we have issues that we want heard when we talk about innovation, creativity, unemployment, underemployment, when we talk about wanting renewable energy. These are topics that young people can bring fresh, innovative ideas forth on the table. And it's not just about the allocations and how we want the money to be spent, but how can we as young people add ideas to the budgeting process that is going to generate revenue for our country. I spoke briefly about agricultural and tech. How can we use drone fertilizers instead of having a farmer in a field spending 2 and 3 days fertilizing plants when a drone can do it in 1 hour? How can we ramp up production? If we have more agro-processing facilities, can we push for trade within the CARICOM region? Because we have access to that market. So sometimes we have to utilize what we already have and market that and push that. But again, if we don't have the consultation, that's the issue. But I also recognize what you're saying, that young people can take up that mantle and that move to make it. However, I would really love and appreciate to see a more people-centered approach where we can have community meetings, where my MP can come and have a normal conversation with us. Really hear us, make us feel like we're part of the process, rather than inviting us to a pre-budget discussion a few days before when the budget is already set, and a post-budget discussion to hear how I feel about it. Because how I feel about it isn't going to change what's already implemented.
But you recognize that it starts with people.
Yes.
Correct, yes.
Yes.
So tell me if, how in Tobago, right? So do you find that there's engagement with the national budget beyond the constitutional allocation, right? And also the subsequent utilization of those funds according to a development agenda?
Interestingly, because where I stay on university, we have an influx of Tobagonian students. So to do my research, this was easy. I just had to knock on somebody and ask them a question. What are your thoughts on the pre-budget? And there was a common denominator. Every youth was like, it's the same thing every year. It's the same thing every year, it's the same thing every year. And I couldn't blame them because in my opinion, the island of Tobago has continuously been subjected to a history of insufficiency of funds where the national budget is concerned. And as the youth, we understand that, we have seen it, and we are trying to understand why is that so. And you know, we have to really take into analysis, because this is a conversation we have, the basis that is used for allocating the funds to the island of Tobago. So I remember the DRC sometime in 2000, that's September 14th, they would have found out that Tobago would have contributed around 4.03% of the national population per minimum capita at a starting point. So we understand that. That's in 2000. So that was used to allocate the budget at that time, 2000. We pay very close attention to the years that I'm using. But now we are in the year 2004, and to date there hasn't been any type of review as to the population of the island of Tobago. I remember I was speaking to a friend from Grenada yesterday. He was like, so why also want more from the budget? And there are like 5 persons in Tobago, and we will laugh and we will banter, and then I had to get serious with him. I was like, listen, when you look at the research, the population of Tobago has increased about 4.85% in 2011 to 5.05% in the year 2002. So when you listen to the Tobago House of Assembly requesting at least 5.8% of that 65.8 billion proposed budget, I think it's well within its means because now we have two situations. One, we have to now allow and follow the precedent that was set in 2000. If you can do an analysis and realize, okay, 4.03%, we give you this amount of the budget, why is it that we're not taking a more productive approach in the year 2024 to realize, okay, we have a growth in the population, and I think the national budget or the allocation to the island should reflect that. Tobago's youth, we are innovative. We are very warrior-like. We don't put water in our mouth to speak about things that are affecting us. And we realize most of our youth, they are delving in the education sector to get degrees that focus on climate change, disaster preparedness, and how can we mitigate that. And we know that the island of Tobago is the smaller of the two when it comes to small island developing states. We saw how we had to prepare for Hurricane Beryl, and our youth want to get involved. But if we have to always deal with a restricted budget, how can we really achieve that development that we are advocating for? Because like you said earlier, most of the money goes towards recurrent expenditure, and then we have that little amount left for development. Yes, I appreciate that we have slow progress, especially where infrastructure is concerned and traffic flow. We see that the Shervan roundabout was just established. We see that in the Canby area, if any of you ever went to Tobago and went to get gas in Canby, it's always a traffic situation. We see that we are expanding the road. So the island is taking that slow progress. The progress is happening, but I think we can do so much more if the national budget and the allocation reflects what the island is advocating for. So I know I said a mouthful, but the youth, we are somewhat disenfranchised because, like they rightfully said, it's the same thing every year. We don't expect much from the budget. If it is that there's a range from 4.03% to about 6.9% according to the DRC, the island always receives the lower end of that spectrum. And we are asking, when are we going to take that progressive step? When are we going to see a budget that really reflects what the island needs? I understand that we know we have the political landscape, we have that relationship between the Assembly and central government. That's a conversation for another day. But as the island youth, we want to see 2024 type development. Why are we still using precedent from 2000? That is my question. Will the Honorable Minister give us some type of insight on Monday? Who knows? Who knows?
So the question I want to ask as well is, it's often said that the budget speech is a speech. But the story of how the budget is going to be actualized is in the supporting documents. The question is, how many people are familiar with these documents to be able to go in before you actually even respond to what the minister has said? Because that's a lot of cheering, and we know this is a lot of politics in the parliament plays over that moment. But then you settle down, you go into the documents, you see what are the precise allocations, what are the projects, what are the capital expenditure, and so on and so forth, right? Is that something that you feel ought to be part of the education process?
I was actually now going to save my comments on that. So I'm glad you asked the question, because here I'm sitting thinking, in social studies, I'm 29 years old, so I leave school a little while, but not too long, right? I'm in the middle. Did I learn anything about Parliament when I was between 12 to 16? Because that's a crucial year. I can't remember. But I do know that we have the National Youth Parliament in place where we take young, bright people. I was a recipient of it. I know many of us, actually all of us in the room are. And I appreciated that my university took me, but high schools usually take Form 6ers, right? About that age group. But we're talking about before that. So your first real exposure is when, hey, my friend growing up, we had a chair, we had a support, we had a comment on Facebook, like the picture. But what's going on before that? So if we start to teach Parliament, we started to do the legislation, we started to tell people, because right now the national conversation is constitution reform. Right? Now, before constitution reform came out, who know about constitution reform? No, I'm not talking about the lawyers in the room. I'm telling you, the average young person, we just know that's the laws of Trinidad and that's it. Only when some story come up, we look into it. So now that constitution reform is on the table and we're discussing it on a national level, political parties are also doing their own thing respectively. We need to do that with the budget as well. We need to do that with almost anything that we bring to the table. Town hall meetings, we need to go as serious as it is. Back to the old days, because like you said before, when Red House was a thing, you can't just walk in and access, oh, you don't do that now, I'd have real police outside, right? It was accessible, it was country level participation. People were proud about making their contributions. We need to bring back now, yes, we're going forward and we want to move to the future, but sometimes you have to bring back the old time days, like Kaleem said. In order for us to move to the future, we need to look at the past and we need to bring back some of those models. We need to really bring back the contributions of how do we get young people more educated, introduce it in the school curriculum, put it in a social studies class book, put it in a little primary school textbook. I know that the Parliament is doing some really great school tours. They're doing these nice little books, like for 5-6-year-olds, coloring books that has a snake and ladder story about how this is very interactive. I'm very excited about it. I'm 29. So you start to introduce what Parliament means to you as little as 5, and you take it and you adjust it per level. When it's around budget time, we talk specifically about the budget. Because I do know the school curriculum is planning to introduce little things like patriotism. I saw on the, there's these about 4 books that usually are published. They divide how the budget is broken down from social sector to the public sector. There's 2 other books that I can't remember, but there's the colors. The Ministry of Finance breaks down different ministries and how it pertains to people. I personally tend to only focus on the orange and the purple one.
Can I ask, do you think there might be an element of culture?
Yeah.
In that even in the
Yes.
home, are children encouraged to understand how money is spent? When all the children are saying, I want this, I want that, the other, are there conversations to help children, parents, with children to say, okay, you want this, you want that. These are my fixed expenses. These are our fixed expenses, electricity bill, water, and so on. That's our recurrent expenses. Do you think it is about a culture of alienation from our systems? Or because the Minister of Finance will say to a lot of people who will be making demands for certain things that we have less revenue or the same amount, we have greater demand, and we have hard choices to make. And nobody envies anybody in that position. Who are you going to please? You have things that circumscribe your ability. In other words, you have debt to pay. If you don't pay it, you miss it, there are consequences and so on. How do you have a conversation in a country that brings that kind of understanding unless you are groomed and developed and nurtured in that culture? Yes, Colin?
I think it is definitely a cultural point, and I think it goes back to that narrative of you go to school, you get your qualifications to get into university. You go to university, you get a degree, you get a job, you get a car, you get a house, you are successful, full stop. And so that has been our culture, that has been the focus, and that has been the hallmark of success. And like you rightfully said, in that process, I could recall for myself growing up as a child, in a home, you ask your parents for something, no, we don't have the money for that, or you get it. It's one or the other, as opposed to perhaps taking an approach of, okay, how do we teach you to save, or make yourself, or teach you or give you the skills to actually make money for yourself. Like when you look at those American television shows, you see children have lemonade stands and they have whatever, and that's the way they would get money to purchase the things they want to purchase. And so culturally for us, a similar concept does not exist. There's no focus or emphasis on entrepreneurial activity or entrepreneurial spirit and initiative. Even amongst young people, it's that narrative of you go to school, you get your qualifications, you get a job, and you work for someone else, as opposed to, hey, you could work for yourself, or you could employ other people. And so that's where we need to have a cultural shift, but that's very difficult to do because this is a perspective that has been ingrained in our society for such a long time that a lot of people, you have to ask if they even trust themselves and trust their own ability to take that type of risk. And then asking parents who grew up in that culture to then teach children about entrepreneurship, that's not something that they could relate to perhaps. And so therein lies the need again to look at the two primary agents of socialization. Yes, the family, but the education system plays a big role. We cannot keep teaching children to only go out there and get your CXC subjects, get a degree, and if you're not able to do that, go to trade school or do or nothing else, as opposed to incorporating entrepreneurial skill training into education from as early of an age of being in primary school in standard 1. You could teach children about, okay, how to come up with a business concept, how to make money to fund that business, and then as you get older, incorporate the opportunities that exist within society into the curriculum. So when you reach to Form 5, if, for example, there are specific grants that exist for small and startup businesses, teach children how to apply for those grants, teach them how to make use of those grants, because we have things there. Is there the knowledge of how to make use of them? And so it really does boil down to me a cultural change that needs to happen. But then the question becomes, whose responsibility is it? Because whilst it might be that, yes, the school needs to play a role, we ourselves also have to play a role and be willing to be open to have that conversation and change that perspective. Because in the earlier conversation that we were having, we were talking about, there's members of parliament are not taking a top to bottom down approach. Yes, there are members of parliament. I don't think people understand that MPs vote for them, not the other way around. The budget is not something that you just have to accept. You can contribute to it. But do people understand that from a cultural perspective when we think about the concept of power and we think about how colonialism has impacted us when we look at power structures? And two, how many people know of office days in constituency offices and then to make use of them? So the responsibility is not just on elected officials and the government, it also is on the family and on the individual. And so we need to have some sort of national conversation on that from both ends to really be able to progress.
I will add to what Kaleem mentioned, that the change is actually happening, because I have a little bit of a different story. I remember the first time I learned about budgeting was when my mother back then gave me $100 and told me that is all the money you're getting to spend on your Christmas gifts. So choose wisely. Back then we had $10 store, so everybody still gets something. And my first means of making money was making paper fans. You all know those paper fans you just roll up and a little coloring, and I used to sell it $15 for one. And I'm very thankful to all my neighbors that purchased. Thank you very much. And that is how I made money to carry out the things that I wanted. I had a spa. I used to do pedicures and manicures for all my families. $5 for a back scratch if you wanted. I remember the call cards and the price list. So we really need to have innovative ways. Now, I was thankful and I benefited from growing up having that experience, but rightfully, as you're all raised, not everybody has that. So it's also not about bringing the information to people, but it's how you bring the information. Not everybody wants to sit down and read all these documents. We're in the age of digitalization. TikTok videos are the way. We have so many ministries now, I have to say, that are doing these reels, that they're bringing the information to you in real time. We need that. We need more of that in ways that we as young persons and the everyday citizens can understand. So it's not about bringing those big documents, because we all here know how thick it is.
Is where the information is.
Right, so how do we not get it?
Ministries to do it.
Correct.
Because you bring a different perspective on the same things
Agreed.
as the technocrats will.
Yes.
But I want to bring you into the conversation as well.
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with history, culture, and education. Now, for instance, I would have walked around my university and asked persons basic questions on Republic Day. What does it mean to be a republic nation? Who was our first president? Who is our current president? And these are questions that students at the university level, majority of them did not know. And I had to, inform them and encourage them. Some persons, I actually walked up to them, asking them if they wanted to participate, and they opposed it. They did not want to participate. And the thing I get is, the answer that I got when I asked, do you want to participate, is, I do not know nothing about Trinidad and Tobago. And I found it very surprising, alarming, and detrimental.
Did you ask why?
Huh?
Did you ask them why they had that position?
why they had that position. That was the answer I got. I do not know, or I don't know what's going on in Trinidad and Tobago. Like, they are there basically to focus on getting the degree, learning what they have to learn, coming out of university and obtaining a job, just to be able to provide for themselves and their families by extension, or gaining a particular title within society. And that, to me, is very detrimental, not only towards them, but towards the national affairs of Trinidad and Tobago.
I'd like us to explore that alienation, because repeatedly we hear, oh, the young people are not interested. The young people have turned off, tuned out, as though that's the fault of the young people. Mm-hmm. So, you being young people, and you have peers, I want you all to help the audience understand, or the people who hold that view, the why of that. Not just that is a symptom, obviously. That is not a cause. But if you drill down into it, help us to understand the source of that.
I think, so part of my point would have been history. I think history has a lot to do with it, and the Caribbean region in particular, having experienced things such as colonialism and having to go through emancipation and then independence, and some Caribbean islands still seeking to become a republic. I think it has a lot to do with our history, and it's sort of a mental slavery kind of thinking, because, you're thinking about, well, my ancestors went through this. Well, some of us would think, my ancestors went through this. So you know what, I'm going to better myself in some sort of way. I'm going to go to school, get the education, make the money, and become something in society that persons are proud of. I have this big title. Even if I go out into the international arena, people will know who I am. So I think that is part of the problem, that sort of colonial thinking and mindset, the history behind
it's a
it.
culture grounded in the historical
Correct.
experience. Yeah?
I think too, that narrative of young people don't do anything has to be challenged on a national level, and challenging it on a national level means showing that young people are capable and showing that young people actually do things, whether it be you spotlight youth. And I know we have, for example, the National Youth Awards that does a very good job at recognizing the young people who are making meaningful contributions to their society. But it is also, the question to me is, okay, what changes when you're 18? Why do you suddenly now trust me to have a voice, to have a say? And now it's no longer 18. We could raise that age up to now people who are at the age of 25 are still alienated from persons who are older. And I think, like Amara said, it does come down to a culture and a history point, like, children, because if you're not, I think employment is tied to adulthood. So if you're not employed, you're still a child, and you're still relegated to that space of child, and children traditionally should just be quiet, listen to their parents, listen to people in positions of authority and positions of power, and not necessarily challenge them or contribute to whatever it is they're doing. So it does come down to a cultural point. Recently, within the past week, the UN would have concluded the Summit of the Future and recognizing where we go next as a planet. And coming out of the Pact for the Future is this document called the Declaration for Future Generations. And in that declaration, there is mention of the phrase intergenerational solidarity 10 times. That really needs to be where the focus is. How do we bring generations together to look at issues in ways that, okay, how does it affect my generation, how does it affect your generation, but how does it affect us collectively? And how can we impart the knowledge that we have from our own perspectives to fix the collective issue that exists? And so it's a cultural thing. There needs to be some level of challenge on that. I always say, young people hold the pen to alter the future. Older persons hold the paper. unless we collaborate, we cannot write something together. And so we need to have that type of conversation where older persons need to trust people. How does that translate into ministry environments or government or bureaucratic processes? It could be as simple as having youth advisory groups that exist within ministries. It could be having a long-standing national youth parliament as opposed to an annual national youth parliament to debate issues on a continuous basis and have those recommendations actually sent to big parliament and have the parliamentarians see what the youth are saying, how they look at this specific social issue, and then having the bigger parliamentarians or the adults debate that same issue and then using the two perspectives together to create a solution. I'm always somebody who's always for working groups, advisory groups that require people to, come together, work together, let young people take the initiative to lead. Mm-hmm. You don't necessarily need to have an older person leading the initiative. But there's that distrust, and that distrust has to be something that we challenge, that we work on addressing. And then quickly, I just want to end on saying, you mentioned that in terms of the budget process, right? The books are the most important things, the statements. Mm-hmm. Those are very voluminous, and Samantha was talking about, TikTok, but in reality, as you rightly said, the crucial information lays there. So if we want young people to understand that, why is there no how-to guide on how to use that? Mm-hmm. So why isn't there a very basic document that anybody, regardless of their education status, could read to say, okay, expenditure is this, income is this, revenue is this. Have a snapshot of the actual page, point it out, show that this is what a parliamentarian is referring to when they say X or when they say Y. So that when you do that, you feel more incentivized to tune into the process and contribute to the process because you understand the process. And there's that lack of understanding. The lack of the perspective that the budget is the day the Minister of Finance comes and speaks, full stop, because we don't understand anything that happens after that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so those issues of a budgeting process that is close and accessible to you may be very well a good idea for a follow-up conversation where you bring the technocrats, you invite the technocrats as youth organizations to come help us go through these things, and we will also tell you how you could make it better the next time so the average person can understand. Now, the generation gap problem is as old as the hills. Mm-hmm. Every generation, older people, they have the same young people, and the young people feel that they're not taken into consideration. But what about those young people who are on the margins of society right now, who are not even going to be listening to the budget? They may be doing something else. How are we? But budgeting is so critical to them. Because there's so much, I'm sure there's going to be in the budget issues addressing unemployment, crime, the fact that so many young people are losing their lives to crime, are involved in crime, and they would not be even part of that conversation or hear that budget. I mean, they're busy doing something else that day. You all are in structured organizations and represent youth, but are your organizations reaching these young people as well? And how can a budget, apart from allocating money, and we talk about monitoring and evaluation, whether it actually achieves, what do you see, and I think we can move the conversation at this point, to what kind of policies do you feel can be introduced that can reach these young people?
I first want to add that definitely stems from reshaping the mindset of it. Budget, not just budget alone, but things to do with sharing information on this level can be sort of not an interest to people. We've discussed that earlier, but sort of reshaping the conversation is one. The introduction of technological aspects using digital platforms, condensing the information, make it more youth-friendly, make it more people-friendly, as a matter of fact. Mm-hmm. The third thing is we have to respect not everybody is in the same social situation as everyone. So while all of us are fortunate to have the privilege of being here this morning, There's a lot of people who don't even dream about coming on a table like this, far less getting into the room. So inclusion is a big part of that in any organization.
They may not know the room exists.
Exactly. So it's about, yes, some of us are very privileged to be in these rooms, but are we taking the information back to where it needs to be? So that's an important thing, decentralizing the information. The fourth thing is, how do we target young people? How do we target the information, bridge it to them, but show them the importance of it? Because we could sit here from now till 10 years from now, every budget panel do this, but they will still always, we cannot please every single person, but we need to at least consider 90% of the people that we need to reach. We have different young people in different social classes, different cultural backgrounds. Those who have accessibility, imagine we still have people who don't have access to internet in Trinidad. We have people who are in rural communities where some people still don't have access to computers. We want to thank the Ministry of Education for at least still bridging that gap. But there's still a lot of things. We have come from a far way, but we have a far more to go. And we need to get more people to be passionate about bridging the gap. As Kaleem rightfully said before I wrap my contribution, it's about taking the old and the new and putting them together and respecting the process.
So Luke, just as in the case of Trinidad, but unusual for Tobago, there has been an uptick in murders. Right? What kind of expenditure could deal with that problem to stem it before it gets even beyond there? So it's one thing to tell people, but I don't think that makes a difference. It is interventions. So where would those interventions be?
Well, in my perspective, when I grew up with old people, and my grandmother always used to say the devil does find work for idle hands to do. And when you look at these young men on the island of Tobago who may appear to be on the opposite side of the law, you have to ask yourself, am I going to stereotype this young man? Am I going to just assume that he is in this type of business? But when you sit down and talk to these young men, they are excellent when it comes to vocational skills, woodwork, electrical, plumbing, but just because they don't fit the stereotype of someone who may have a full CXC certificate now, they don't feel like, okay, I could be represented in these spaces. I'm glad that Amaris would have touched on the cultural norms, because in Tobago, the cultural norm is you get your full certificate to get a government job. I remember when I finished CXC and I was like, Granny, I want to go to sixth form. She was like, what? What were you telling me about sixth form? I couldn't even speak about university in my house, because the norm is get your subjects, go and get a government job, because the older generations viewed someone in their household getting a government job as a badge of honor. Now, when it comes to mitigating crime, we have to start to generate funds. We have our police youth clubs, they are very active, but are they funded efficiently? How can we, include the people who will really benefit from the initiatives of the police youth club? Because when you look at some of the people in there, yes, we have our usual youth leaders, we have our usual, people who are in university, people who can contribute to their community. But what about the ones who don't face the reality that we face? How are we allocating funds to, meet them where they are? We oftentimes always like to force people to get involved. We always like to tell them, well, you have to know about this because it will affect you. But do we actually sit down and have a conversation with them? Do we understand how they grew up, the realities we face, and how we can allocate funds to stop that pattern and ensure that the upcoming generation don't fall into that line? What are we doing? We need to meet them where they are. And you ask if our youth groups are doing it. Yes, all youth groups may do it. We may do the work, but then again, what are the decision makers doing? You can't go into a community dressed up in your suit and tie and pretending that you're going and ask them questions. You take a little photo of, today I stepped into my village, blah, blah, blah. We won't fall for that, and we know what is real from what is fake. And you would have asked earlier when it comes to youth and the decision makers and the power we may have. While we may have a seat at the decision-making table, do we have a meaningful seat at that table? Sometimes it's like we are sitting by the kiddies table, and then the decision makers are there at their big boy table, and they come now when it's time to take a nice photo up and they give the nice captions. Today we had the perspective of youth, blah, 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 and we are like, when is it going to end?
Yeah. Okay, so we're into the last 4 minutes of the session, and I'd like to give each of you, starting with you, a chance to do a wrap-up for about 40 seconds.
I'll take less than that because I think we've all said quite enough. I just want young people to recognize the importance of voicing their opinions and also having their voices heard. And as you rightfully said, the onus is on us to ensure that we get to the relevant persons. And I also want to appeal to the decision makers to also come and level with us. Let's have a conversation. We're both here for the serving of our country. Let's put country first and work together towards creating the sustainability we hope for.
I want to see a change in the way in which we budget. The process, it's time that we reevaluate the process and ask ourselves whether or not the process really is representative of Trinidad and Tobago or people in power in Trinidad and Tobago. I want to see more engagement with people on the ground at the community level. I don't want to be in a position where the only time we see elected officials and people in power is when it's an election year. Part of the budget process is getting perspectives and knowing what we need to fix. And we can't know what we need to fix if we don't listen. So I really want to see a change to a more consultative budget process, but consultative with the average citizen, not the technocrats in the room.
Right. I am so happy that Samantha mentioned let's put country first. And I really connect with her on that point, mainly because we have a culture of turning everything into political news and political drama. And I do believe the faster we move away from that sort of culture of politicizing everything is the faster we will get initiatives off the ground and we will get youth more involved. And as Kaleem rightfully mentioned, we need to reframe the way in which we budget, in which we consult with the people on the ground.
My question will be, will progress be in the room? That is my big question. Is progress going to be in the room on when the budget is presented in the Honorable House? Because, like I said, for every $100 national dollar that's spent, we spend $4 in Tobago. That is not progressive. That is very counterproductive. If we want to prioritize the island's youth and by extent the island's development, something needs to be done. It can't be that we are still using like bits and pieces from 2024. Something needs to be done. And that is my question. Will progress be in the room? Who knows?
I wanted to just say that for young people that are watching, come Monday the 30th September 2024, make sure to find some point in your day, it's a very long budget debate, but find some point in your day to actually listen to the conversation, to contribute where you can. There's a comment section on Facebook and YouTube, just plugging it there, and really take it in, because if you don't appreciate that you have a voice now, you basically will not be part of the change when we have to do it later in our life. So honor that you have a decision, that you could contribute it now, that you are very much important and part of the table, and this is a privilege for us to be here, and that we take back the points to young people in Trinidad and Tobago.
Great. I'd like to thank all of you for your very thoughtful input today. I think it's a conversation that you all will take forward to your groups. But most of all, it's not just your groups, it's the networking, I think, and with many other groups that are not in this room. And I hope you look on, and I hope you're part of the conversation that will follow. And I would like to thank the home audience for being part of this.
If I may, Senator, before you close us off, I just want to remind the young people looking on that next week, Thursday, we will also be live once again for the post-budget discussion. Yeah. I believe it's 11 to 12 p.m. or 10 to 11 a.m. We will get the timing right. Stay tuned to the Parliament social media, so we will post the information.
Thank you very much for that.
And thank you for being our moderator.
Yes, thank you so much. You were amazing.
My pleasure, my pleasure. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.